Well, hello everyone. Today we're going to be doing a inking time lapse. This is a piece that took me a very, very long time, and it's also the second time in my life that I've been doing gold leafing, but the first time I've been doing it as an adult. I did it as a project when I was in elementary school, and now I'm going to attempt to do this piece. It was originally for the Square Carousel Challenge. For the 20s, it was the first Square Carousel Challenge of the year, and I've had this footage for quite a while, but I'm finally able to edit it and talk about it. So you can see here I started with a small thumbnail, and then I translated that into a bigger line drawing. The reason why I did a line drawing was because this is my first time using this huge watercolor panel that was pre-made. Usually I make my own watercolor panels, or I work on flat watercolor paper. These panels were from Hobby Lobby, and I have since done quite a few pieces on them, but this was my first time doing it on this kind of piece. So I wanted to have my lines very accurate. Also, the piece itself is very simple in its design. It's not as intricate as my other illustrations usually are. So my lines had to be very clean and very perfect, as compared to when I'm doing lots of little details. I can kind of play around with mistakes. But if I was to make a mistake in this piece, which I did, it's very noticeable. So the line, when I do my line work out to scale, I then can use transfer paper and transfer that design directly onto the canvas so that I don't have to think about proportions or what the kind of overall design is going to look like. I can just focus on making a really clean line and follow the pencil line that I already have there. So that's what I did, was I went ahead and transferred it onto the canvas. So what I first attempted to do, and this was my first really big mistake, and probably the biggest mistake I made through the whole piece, was that normally I'm used to working on hot press watercolor paper. So if I want a straight line across the entire thing, I usually can tape down the blue tape on both sides and then swipe the ink or watercolor over that part of the piece and then let it dry, remove the tape, and you have a nice clean line. What I didn't realize was that there were significant grooves in this watercolor canvas. So while that works great for blending watercolors and adding a lot of water and using a lot of techniques that use a lot of water, it's not great for when you're using and trying to do perfect lines, clean lines. So you'll see when I remove the tape, the lines are just a hot mess because they bled underneath the tape and then they got smudged, and they just did not turn out how they were supposed to or how they normally do. So I then had to really go back in with a lot of white gouache and fix those lines, and I do that periodically because I was waiting for the ink to dry more and going back and forth and trying to move around consistently. It was really hard to get over the frustration of trying to get my lines perfect. This design was supposed to be inspired by the 1920s, that Art Deco style, but also a little prior to that, the style of Mucha. So I was combining Mucha with a more modern Art Deco, like later in the time period, more of something you would see from a like Great Gatsby type illustration. The circle, the halo around the cat, is very indicative of Mucha's work. And then the border was more of the Great Gatsby Art Deco style of framing. Since the blue tape didn't work, one of the techniques that I'm using here is that I am actually using boxes that are taller than the canvas, and then I am suspending a ruler over the piece. And then I'm using that ruler that's hovering about a half inch above the piece. I'm holding that down, and I'm using it like you would use a ruler regularly. It's just suspended above the piece so it actually doesn't smudge the ink lines or get ink on it, because the actual tip of the paintbrush that has the ink on it is beneath the ruler, and it's the metal part of the paintbrush that is against the ruler that still allows you to get a cleaner line. It's not perfect, but it does work fairly nicely, and much better than the blue tape. overall, some other issues that I had were getting the circles to be lined up, getting the borders to look realistic. I obviously really struggled with the circles. I used a bunch of different options for stencils and then paper plates and bowls and things to try to get my lines to be really nice. The problem with that is when you're using the ink, it's a little bit different than watercolors. And not super thrilled with how this came out. I know it's not perfect. You'll see at the end of this video on the finished piece, I did do some online editing in Photoshop to kind of fix little blemishes that I noticed. Some of the circles are a little uneven. And luckily I can fix all that stuff up in Photoshop, but you know, for the original piece, those inconsistencies are there. Although I will say that a lot of times I don't necessarily notice them in the moment. It's when I come back later that I notice them, or when I'm actually editing the video, I'll notice more mistakes than when I actually look at the piece in person. And I think a lot of people don't catch those mistakes until later as well, because the overall piece looks better in person than it does when it's digitally finished. So this was like I said, my first time gold leafing as an adult, and I do not remember what kind of gold leafing we used when I was a kid, but I remember it being fairly simple to put some glue down, lay the gold leafing down, and heat it up, and it kind of melts a little bit, and then it would dry nice and smooth. That is not what happened with this. I did not buy, or I take that back. I did buy gold sheets from Hobby Lobby that were single sheets, but I didn't like the gold. It was like a darker bronzy gold. It wasn't this bright gold that the flakes had. So I wanted to go with the brighter gold, even though it meant I would get more of a cracked gold look from the flakes. I also didn't buy gold leafing glue, partly because it's expensive, but also partly because I didn't know if I would actually like gold leafing, and I didn't want to buy all of this glue that's really expensive and then never use it again or give it away to somebody for free. So I am using a tacky glue, and I'm also using a little bit of Mod Podge to try to figure out what's the best option for glues that I already owned. Overall, I think it came out okay, but I definitely had to do a ton of layers. And when it came to finalizing this piece in Photoshop, I didn't have... photographing gold leafing is really, really difficult, and scanning gold leafing is practically impossible unless you scan it from multiple angles. So I ended up digitally enhancing the gold leafing and adding more gold leafing to the corners, and before I added it to the original piece, I played around with it in Photoshop because I was getting really frustrated with the original piece and how the gold leafing was sitting and how it was looking. So I went back later and I finished the original with gold leafing, but towards the end of this video, you'll see that there is a little bit of a jump from the last cut that you see to the final product at the end of the video. I will say I did find a number of interesting tutorials about the different types of glue that you can use with gold leafing. Obviously, if you're doing it in a professional setting, if you're doing like a frame or a vase or something that isn't artwork, well, it's artwork in its own right, but it's not like it needs to be a nice finishing touch because that's the whole purpose of the design. Whereas here I can play around with it, I can make it a little bit more stylized, it can be a little rougher, and maybe that's not the original idea that I was going for, but it does bring a level of consistency to the piece to have these kind of rough, crinkly, foiled gold mixed with these really nice, clean black lines. It adds a nice contrast in my opinion. And that's kind of like the happy accidents of things. Sometimes, well, every time pieces don't turn out how I see them in my head, but when I have a piece like this where it evolved and there were challenges and things that I had to overcome, all of that goes into the piece and the final product. And I do think that this illustration was relatively good. There are obviously mistakes that I would like to go back and change, but I was pretty happy with the final result that I turned into Square Carousel, and like I said, I've done a few adjustments to the original after the fact. I was hoping it would be on a featured wall from my May Open Studios, but due to the coronavirus, my May Open Studios was canceled. So hopefully you'll see this piece on a few snapshots on my Instagram later in the fall when we have our next Open Studios. Overall, I think that about covers it for this design. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing. I make new art videos, and tutorials, and creative videos, and time lapses every single Friday. I also make travel videos on my other channel if you want to check that out, and I'm working on some bus life stuff as well. Be sure to head on over to the community tab. I always have some polls going on what you'd like to see next, or you could leave a comment in the comment box below. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, remember to create, love, and travel on. Bye!